Hey, alright, and welcome to the Engine ID Lab. I've already produced a video talking about once you find the engine numbers on how to decode them. So now I'm going to go over finding them on the piece of equipment as well as inspecting the piece of equipment to identify the list of items here below. Okay, the first thing we typically need to do is, in order to expose a lot of these components, we're going to need to pull the shroud. And that's going to be different based on the engine that we have. So that's part of where you need to just kind of like identify the shroud and then identify all the points of attachment that need to be taken off so that you can see it. And I'm going to start with this old Briggs & Stratton, and then I'll show you at least one other engine and a few things, maybe a few other things along the way here. So first things first, we'll get the shroud off, and then we'll talk about where the numbers on Briggs & Stratton engines typically are. So this particular shroud is held on by 3 7/16 bolts, and just because it's good practice, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the spark plug wire while I work on the machine, and then I'm going to take out the bolts that are holding it on. And knowing that we're going to have to find the carburetor and the throttle shaft on it, and I know that that's already underneath my air cleaner here, I'm going to take off the air cleaner at the same time. Okay. I'm going to leave this connected so that I don't have to readjust it later, because that is an adjustment. But I got enough slack in the cable here after releasing this clip that we can see what we need to see. On this particular engine, the engine numbers are stamped right into the side of the shroud here. On a fair amount of Briggs & Stratton engines, you might also find them stamped into here. On some of the newer engines, it might be on a heat shield riveted to the side that goes above the muffler. Okay? So I'm going to take this, and I'm just going to set that gently off to the side. And now we can see a fair amount of the engine here. So if we take a look at the list, we have our flywheel here, the ignition modules right here. We follow the spark plug wire down to the spark plug. This right here is my carburetor assembly. And then the spring is actually covering up the throttle shaft. So here's my throttle shaft right here. Okay. Here's my governor spring. This particular engine is an air vane governor. So the governor lever on this one would be basically where the spring attaches to the air vane here. Because this is my air vane that's going to move back and forth as the engine speeds up and slows down. And then the crankcase breather tube would be this tube right here. You can see it goes into the rubber elbow. It's going to go all the way across the engine over to here, which is where our valve box cover is. Air filter type. This style air filter is the older style oil wetted foam air filter type. And then the last item to identify is the valve cover. Now this engine being an older engine, this is a valve and block engine. So what that means is that the valves are in the block next to the cylinder, and they're not in the head. The cylinder head gasket is right here, and the head is basically a piece of metal with a bunch of cooling fins in it and a small combustion chamber on the bottom side. So over here, there is a cover that covers up the valve springs that are down in the block. And if you take a look at the carburetor from the angle that you're at now, the carburetor connects to a tube. This tube runs all the way across the engine to the other side and then into the intake port. Likewise, the muffler threads directly into the exhaust port. So both the valves are on this side of the head. The intake is on the top, the exhaust is on the bottom, and then if we go further in, the springs are behind the cover back here by the muffler. Okay, so those are the parts on this older Briggs engine. I'm going to free you guys up from the mount and try not to shake it around too much so that you can see the valve cover. And this cover right here is the valve cover. Behind it are the valve springs so that we can release the valves and let them out. And here is that breather tube coming across and going into the valve cover, because part of the valve cover is a filter element to ensure that only the blow-by gases from the crankcase get drawn out of the crankcase through the breather tube and then back over to the inlet of the carburetor, and not oil vapor or oil mist. Okay, so that's that Briggs & Stratton engine. Right next to me here we have a Tecumseh powered snowblower, and on some of these Tecumsehs the engine number was right underneath the electric start module, and it was also stamped into the shroud. This is a slightly newer one. It's not quite as old as some of the older Tecumsehs that had it stamped in. And so these ones, if you go down on the side of the shroud, you will typically see a sticker, and you can see here, if we can get it to focus, this is a HMSK80 model number Tecumseh, and then there's a spec number behind the bar. Okay, so that's where to find or look for engine numbers on this Tecumseh snowblower. Oh, and don't forget, you got to put the engine back together exactly how you found it, because it might be something like this one that's a customer machine. So we got to make sure things like the spark plug wire get into the little notches and don't get pinched by the shroud. And we got to get everything back to just how it was. That's why I didn't want to loosen this adjustment here, because this distance matters. I left that together so that it would make it easier to reassemble it, even though it took me a smidge longer to take apart. It should make it a little bit easier to get everything back together. We got to make sure that things go on in the proper order as well. Okay, there we go. Sometimes you got to wiggle around till they all fit just right. And then, as always, you want to make sure things get started by hand. I might use power tools to take things out, to speed things up, but I always start my fasteners by hand, so that way I know that they're not cross-threaded. Alright, there we have it, back together. Okay, let's take a look at the same things but on this Kohler. So if we take a look on this Kohler's got a sticker on the side of the shroud that lists its model number as well as a spec number and a serial and a build date. And so that's where we'll come for the information on those. This one, we got to pull the cover off. And if we look around it, there's some bolts. I've pre-loosened them so I can do this one-handed. We got to take out the oil dipstick in order to get the cover off. Once we got the cover off, we can see the top of the engine's exposed, and we should be able to identify just about most of our parts here. You can see we've got the flywheel and flywheel fins. Right next to it is the ignition module. Follow that down to the spark plug, and for the spark plug here. I'm already touching my valve cover right here. This is an overhead valve engine, so these are usually, the valve covers are much easier to access and find. This tube that comes out of the valve cover right here, and then that goes over to the air filter, this is our breather tube. Again, this is because there's a hole that goes from the cylinder head to the block in the crankcase. There's an airflow path from the crankcase up through the cylinder head and then into the air filter element for crankcase gases. So that way we don't have a buildup of blow-by gases in the crankcase, and some of those blow-by gases have gasoline mixed in with it, so we can bring that back around to the intake of the carburetor and reburn that. We got to find our governor spring and lever yet, as well as identify the air filter element. So we've got to take off our air filter cover here. So there's our cover. And we can see that this is a pleated paper or dry type filter element. Pull that off and out of the way. And we can now see the front of the carburetor. And so if we look around, here's the carburetor. This particular carburetor has two shafts. There's a choke at the front of the carburetor and a throttle right back here that's nearest the engine. The throttle's always nearest the engine. Coming out, oops, let's get it so you guys can see. Coming out from behind the air filter housing is my governor lever, my throttle lever that goes to my control or speed selector lever. You'll see there's another one back here. And let me get to a different position. Right here is my governor lever that comes from the engine. And then up here you can see the red governor spring behind the rest of the bracketry there. Okay, so that's where the governor lever and spring are on this particular engine. Just like with all the other engines, once you find a throttle shaft on the carburetor, you can follow the linkage back to the governor lever and then the governor spring. Okay, so as part of what this assignment is kind of like a scavenger hunt for items on the engine, and they're not always going to be in the same place. But this would be an example of older Kohler Courage 20 horse single cylinder. Hope that helps get you started. Any questions, come find me in the lab, or feel free to message me, and we'll see you in the lab. Thanks for watching.